Welcome to Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. This episode is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. If you use promo code ETR on your first time deposit over at Underdog, you get up to a $100 deposit match bonus. And we'll be talking about Underdog Fantasy and best ball today with Sam Sherman. Excited for that for this show. We'll be going into a little bit about why when you're analyzing tournament strategy, it's difficult to look just at finals advance rates. And then from that, we'll get into discussion about running backs versus wide receivers. So, yeah, I'm excited to bring Sam on the show. You can follow him at Sherman_FFB on Twitter. He's had a couple really good threads lately on these topics that we're going to be discussing today, which is why I decided to bring him on. He's also a friend of our ship chasing friends, and he is on the show ADP Chasing on Friday afternoons with Davis Maddock over there. So, Sam, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on, Mike. I'm really excited to chop it up with some best ball theory stuff. A lot I've been digging into so far this offseason, and it's crazy. It's only April, so yeah, a lot more to do, but excited to talk through of some of this stuff today.
Yeah, I'm happy that you're still doing ADP chasing. I was worried the ship chasing guys might like ban you from the show when you started this running back propaganda on Twitter, but it's good to see that you haven't been censored yet.
It's funny, yeah. Actually, neither Pat or Pete have answered any of my texts in a couple days, so I'll have to double check on that one. But yeah, as far as I know, I'm still a part of ADP chasing. We'll let the lawyers sort that out, but.
Awesome. Well, if you are watching on the Established Run YouTube channel, I'll be bringing up on the screen some of the charts and stuff that we're talking through, but we'll make sure the audio listeners get a really good sense of what's going on as well. First thing, Sam, there's so much going on with trying to analyze the best way to play Best Ball Mania in particular, and the general big tournaments that stem from that over on Underdog Fantasy. And the way these tournaments generally work is we're looking at a regular season that's weeks 1 through 14. Teams advance to the playoff stages. There's 3 playoff stages, and you have to kind of win your group each of the first 2 stages. And then you get into a big finals. And it can be difficult to analyze like what works and what's the best way to build for these playoff stages because the sample size on the actual playoff weeks is really, really low. And that's something that you wrote about in terms of the flaws of the finals advance rate.
Yeah, it's really tricky. And I think you described it well, that finals advance rate, I think the easiest way to think of it is it's kind of the sum of sort of 3 different, not the sum, but the product of 3 different advance rates. It's your regular season advance rate. That's typically just referred to as advance rate. And then it's your semifinal win rate. So your ability to win in the first tournament in week 15. And then your final win rate, your ability to win in the week 16 tournament, which then gets you to the finals in week 17. So that's really what finals advance rate is. I think just getting into the numbers of how it actually works. And, this research, I think, before I get into the numbers in the chart here, let's sort of like lay out sort of why this is the case. And I think player examples are helpful to help us understand why finals advance rate might be flawed. So originally this research was sort of started by me remembering last year, a guy like Cam Akers. He had the 3rd highest finals advance rate of any running back, better than, Josh Jacobs, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, all these guys that were absolute smashes through the season, because Akers had his best week of the season at the best time in week 16. He put up over 30 half PPR fantasy points after, I think, only putting up above 15 one other time throughout the entire season. So just sun running with the timing there, and that skyrocketed him to the 3rd highest finals advance rate. And then on the other side of the coin, you can take a guy like Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams had 6 spike weeks of over 25 points last year in fantasy, which is massive, like farly outpaced any other wide receiver in that metric. And he had a finals advance rate that was 3 times worse than average, because his 2 worst weeks of the season, or I think 2 of his 3 worst weeks of the season, came in weeks 15 and 16. So those are just 2 like player level examples to help you understand why finals advance rate can be biased. And that's essentially what this chart shows here, that only 15% of the variation in finals advance rates at the player level is explained by cumulative scoring weeks 1 through 16. So that's a very weak relationship. And then if you flip to the next chart, which shows, so this chart here shows week 15 and 16 scoring versus finals advance rates. And here we have, still relatively weak relationship, but we see a lot more signal here that the R squared jumps up to 44% if you only include weeks 15 and 16. So basically, like, it's fair to say that the finals advance rate is more so picking up on just 1 or 2 weeks of data in weeks 15 and 16 than how a player's contribution throughout the entire regular season. So I think that is a major flaw.
Yeah. And, I like the examples you chose too, because like, obviously there's gonna be some players we expect to perform a little bit better at the end of the season than the beginning of the season, but you've pointed out two of the biggest outliers on both sides. And there's nothing in the data that, we would say ahead of time that would say Cam Akers, and if anything, we would have said Cam Akers will be worse at the end of the season, not better. Kind of the way we approach running backs like him and Devontae Adams, spike week type wide receiver. That's the kind of guy you want in the playoffs. So I'm working on like a big Best Ball Mania manifesto. I think part 1 should be out today, looking at stacking in the playoffs and kind of trying to answer, solve the problem you're coming up with, which is like, what's predictable versus what's just descriptive, So we know these guys have high advance rates. That's going to affect, even if you look at roster construction and whatnot, it's going to affect that because it's just basically which players happen to do really well that particular week. So one way I tried to solve it in my article is treating each week as if it could have been a playoff week. So instead of looking at, you mentioned like the finals advance rates to some product of advance rate in the regular season, winning the quarterfinals, winning the semifinals, and getting there. I'm kind of looking at advance rate in the regular season by itself. And then, okay, what are the odds that this team had the weekly upside necessary to win, a quarterfinal structure, which is a top 1 out of 10 score? And looking at, okay, for weeks 1 through 17, how often did they get a top 1 out of 10 score? So breaking down essentially all of the best ball playoff teams from last year and treating them as if they were 17 different teams each for the 17 different weeks, which, there's some flaws because the end of season dynamics aren't the same as beginning season. There's some bye weeks in there, but it does let us grow the sample quite a bit and at least, hopefully tease out a bit more information on the structural side of things where you get less of that bias of like, oh, Cam Akers happened to, go off in 15 and 16.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. And yeah, I think like phrased a little bit differently, I'm kind of the mindset that sequential scoring in weeks 1 through 17 is like more or less just random. I think there are specific examples like, rookie wide receivers. We know they'd get better over the course of the season. I think you'd also make the argument that maybe like handcuff running backs would expect them to get better over the course of the season, or at least like more likely to have a spike week later in the season rather than earlier. I'm not saying those dynamics don't exist, but I think like it's mostly kind of random. And
yeah,
I think what your approach makes a ton of sense. I think maybe you could even just look at, just the back half of the season. Maybe you take weeks 11 through 17 and run your analysis that way. Just something I think we really got to grow the sample more than just basically 2 weeks in every season to really feel better about this finals advance rate thing. So really interested to see like how your research comes out there. I know you have some preliminary stuff, but that seems like a good way to go about it to tease out some of the signal from the noise.
Yeah, and zooming out, I guess maybe we didn't hit on enough of like why we're so focused on finals advance rate, but
Yeah.
in these tournaments, like it's a very top heavy prize pool. In week 17, the finals is top heavy, but that's like even top heavy when you compare it to all the prizes that you're given throughout the entire course of the tournament. So the expected value of your team increases exponentially as you advance through the stages. So we're in this situation where it's like, well, the finals is the most important thing. We know it's the most important thing, but just because it's important doesn't necessarily mean we can control it. So we're trying to kind of play off those two things. Like, what do we actually control to increase, the expected value of our teams the most? You also took a look at, the semifinals win rate versus finals win rate. And, there's a bit of variance there because again, these are uncorrelated tournaments. You win your semifinals, the finals is a brand new tournament. You're starting from zero.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, let me so let's get back on sort of like the argument that I lay out. So I think we kind of effectively laid out like the player level argument for why advance rates are biased. We talk about Devontae Adams,
Mhm.
we talk about Cam Akers. I think that's pretty straightforward, but I would be open to the idea if people are like, hey, I get that player level advance rate stuff is biased, but once we like zoom out and look at a roster construction lens, maybe some of that noise comes out in the wash and we can actually get meaningful insights from looking at roster constructions, like defined however you want to define it, but maybe wide receiver heavy roster constructions versus running back early roster constructions. I can see the argument that yeah, once we zoom out of the individual player to the roster construction level, maybe these finals advance rates mean something. And I tested this, and I largely found that with the data we have, I was pretty skeptical of the idea that there's a lot of signal here. So, example one, which the chart shows, only 5% of the variation in finals win rate is explained by semifinals win rate. And why I think that is important is like if like these roster constructions are giving us some signal to say, hey, if you drafted in this sort of way, it gives your team inherently sort of a higher weekly ceiling. That should be true in both like the semifinals win rate and the finals win rate, because those are very similar tournaments. Essentially, you need to finish in the top 6 to 10% of those weeks to advance. So if that argument is true, we should see like signal here, and we don't. And I think like the main reason that's true is not because roster construction has no impact on this type of thing. It's just that we just have 2 years of data that we're working with. So like anytime you're using 2 years of data and trying to draw big conclusions from it, you're not going to get a ton of signal. So that's my main point here, is that like I think roster construction, if we had a large enough data set, would have a signal here, but we don't see that with the data we have.
Yeah,
So
and 2 years, like it's not 2 years. It's two specific weeks in 2 years. You
yeah,
know, so it's like it's very small. Um,
yeah,
it's
and I think
also
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
what was you say? There's some difficulty in like looking at the R squared too when we have like kind of a binary like one didn't win type of thing. I know like some of the stuff I'm doing is more like a cohort analysis where the trends sort of seem obvious, but like it's tough to find that middle ground because like the R squared might not necessarily be good, and then the cohort analysis looks good, and you're trying to sort of find that middle ground. I'm saying like, okay, this is descriptive and seems like it makes sense, but it didn't explain the variance a ton, just purely from that R squared metric.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, again here, like I'm not claiming I'm some like data science expert and I have all the answers, like that this is a perfect way to do this analysis. I will say like if you're kind of skeptical of this, like another way to look at it is just say, okay, define roster constructions like however you want to in sort of a mutually
Mhm.
exclusive way. You're going to find that the roster constructions that worked in 2021 like don't always work in 2022. Like there's been sort of wild swing. Like sometimes we do see like 2021 and 2022 this same roster construction does well both years, but more often than not you're going to see just like great one year, bad the next year. And I'm just like that's what I was trying to get at with this sort of view, that like I don't think we have enough years of data to really parse out signal from finals advance rate. So that's
Yeah,
my
we need to.
main point here.
Yeah, we need to get creative, and like you said, like it's also like by the time we do have enough data, everything will have changed so much. The landscapes can change in terms of the players. It can change in terms of the strategies people are using, what the ADP is. So, but that's sort of what makes the game fun, is like we kind of like combine this, do our best to kind of get at the right answer while critically thinking about how it could be different this year. And it's never quite solved. But I do think it's important
Yeah.
what you've pointed out to just be like, listen, if someone's just quoting finals advance rate to you, it probably doesn't mean a whole lot. It's more like a description of what happened in one or two specific weeks the last 2 years, more so than it is an indication of what strategy plays well.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, I think if you're using finals advance rates, like I recommend people use like the RotoViz roster construction explorer or do their own research, because I think it's interesting. I don't think the data is completely useless. I'm not saying that. I just think you have to be very careful with how you interpret it, and the way you just said it is totally right. Like I think you should interpret it as, okay, this strategy over the past few years had a successful finals advance rate. Let's look for additional data points to try to back up this potentially interesting strategy, more than like if you interpret it as like this had the highest finals advance rate over the past few years, therefore this is the optimal strategy for 2023. I think you're making so many leaps in assumptions going that route. I just think you got to be very careful with how you're interpreting it more as like these were the historical results, less as like this shows what the optimal strategy is going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Let's, change the conversation a bit here, sticking obviously with best ball, but looking at running back versus wide receiver, and on Underdog in particular. I think, what we've seen, Sam, is a certain segment of the fantasy population makes up a lot of the underdog drafters, especially early in the year, like we see right now. And these are the kind of people that come from that, like you mentioned, RotoViz, that like RotoViz type background, where a little bit more wary over like what type of running backs you're taking, how many you're taking. Proponents of Sean Siegel's, zero RB approach, which for people who aren't familiar with zero RB, the idea is, especially in like 3 wide receiver flex leagues, which Underdog is, the flex scoring is typically a wide receiver. Now, I believe Sean's original article on this was in full PPR scoring, which is an important distinction between that and what's happening on Underdog. But the idea is you kind of want 4 stud wide receivers in your lineup as much as possible. It was initially just like a redraft strategy, not necessarily for best ball. And to do that, you want to take lots of wide receivers early and then take advantage of the fragility of the running back position by taking like handcuff running backs, pass catching running backs, stuff of that nature late, where you can fill your RB spot okay, and then you're going to run into some projectable RB1 weeks just as guys get hurt and guys elevate in terms of status. So that's sort of the idea behind zero RB in general, but it's really become, we've seen it applied to best ball in ways that aren't necessarily true, which is kind of what your thread was about.
Yeah, that was the main point of the thread. And I want to say up front that, this wasn't intended to be like an attack on Sean Siegel's original article, or even like attack on zero RB in general. Because I think Pat actually gave me some pushback here that if you look at Sean Siegel's original article, he like the way I describe zero RB principles is not exactly how he lays it out. So I think that's fair. Like I'm not saying this is not like taking down Sean Siegel's zero RB article. That's not the intention of it. My intention is more so just like how those zero RB principles seem to have been carried down over the years and used in best ball drafts. Like I always heard people say, the wide receiver or the flex spot is a 4th wide receiver spot. Wide receivers are spikier than running backs. You can find running back spike weeks more easily later in drafts than you can find wide receiver spike weeks. Those are not things that like Sean Siegel is outright saying in his article, but that's sort of like what people have been saying over the past couple of years. And I think at this point, drafters are kind of assuming those things are true, or at least drafting those things are true. So that was sort of what I wanted to push back on in this article. So yeah, I think we should sort of like look at these things one by one, perhaps starting with the flex piece, Leone, if that makes sense, and can sort of go through my arguments for each one.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're watching, you can kind of see average weekly scores by weekly positional tier. And if you look at flex eligible players, which on Underdog would be your RB3s and your wide receiver 4s, the average weekly scoring for running backs and wide RB3s and wide receiver 4s is essentially the same, which runs contrary a little bit to what we were saying, kind of the idea that your flex player should be a wide receiver. That's not necessarily the case, is what the actual data shows us.
Exactly. Yeah. And just to be super clear, like what this data is, like wide receiver 1, RB1, that's defined by like weekly score. So not like preseason ADP. We'll get into that later, but this is just like weekly score. How do these positions score points? If you look at the last 10 years of data and just look at fantasy points, you see that wide receiver 1s and running back 1s score basically equally, both around 22 points per week on average. Then you start to see a gap from wide receiver 2 to RB2. 14 for wide receiver 2, 12.5 for RB2. So there's a bit of a gap there. And then same thing with wide receiver 3 versus RB3. Again, sort of a 2-point gap between those positional tiers. But yeah, we got to remember that the players that are actually competing for the flex are the wide receiver 4s versus the RB3s, just because of how Underdog starting lineups work. So once you get down to that, yeah, those positions are basically scoring the same amount of points. And yeah, if you flip to the next chart, Leone, I think you can see that in a little bit more detail. I essentially just did the calculation of, okay, weekly, what position is actually scoring in the flex? If you essentially just like ranked all running backs 1 through 24, ranked all wide receivers 1 through 36, and then see like the players left over, which of those would make up the flex. Actually, historically, running backs would slightly outpace wide receivers in the flex. I'm willing to say it's like basically a tie between running backs and wide receivers. I'm not drawing a huge difference between 46% and 38%. But I think it has been unfairly characterized that wide receiver is scoring in the flex and it's a 4th wide receiver position. I don't really see how you get around the fact that the data just shows that that's not true.
Yeah. And again, I think, a lot of this, and you point this out, has to do with the scoring. A lot of these concepts were originally developed for full PPR formats, and people are, so not everyone, but some people will try and force fit a strategy into something else. And in half PPR scoring, like it's a big difference. If we looked at these charts with full PPR scoring, we'd see different result, but that's not the way the scoring works on Underdog Fantasy. I think what people, I don't want to go too out of order here, but I think like the natural response, Sam, that like people have when they see something like this is, okay, you ranked the running backs and they came up in the flex as much as wide receivers, but what if you adjusted for the ADP of these players? Like,
yeah. Oh yeah.
Like are these the running backs that you're actually drafting? Is there more predictability in the wide receivers that you're drafting being in the flex spot?
That's a great question. I think like totally fair pushback. So let me break up your question into 2 pieces. Like number one, I want to address like what I'll call the undrafted effect. I think you could look at these numbers and say, hey, you're counting running backs that basically no one's ever drafted. Like no one's drafting Deion Jackson last year for his 20 points in whatever week he had it, which I think is fair. But my pushback would be is like, that dynamic happens for wide receivers too. Like I could find anecdotal examples, of guys last year where that happened. I think Jamal Agnew is maybe one off the top of my head. So I think like there's anecdotes on both sides. So what is actually true if we look at the numbers? So this chart here shows what happens if we remove undrafted players using the Underdog ADP. And we have historical Underdog ADP, so we can just kind of look at how many players get drafted each year at each position, and then sort of make some threshold cutoffs and say, any running back drafted after RB 70-ish is basically undrafted, and their points shouldn't count for this analysis. That's more or less how I did things. If you do that, you do see a bit of the undrafted effect come true. Wide receivers go from scoring in the flex 42% of the time to 48% of the time. Running backs also go up though. They go up from scoring the flex 45% of the time to 46% of the time. The real position that gets hurt here, which I think makes sense, is tight ends. Like there's guys like Connor Hayward, 1 catch for 20 yards and a touchdown. Like I don't think our listeners, they're, if you're listening to this in April, you're probably a sicko. You probably don't even know what team Connor Hayward's on, right? Like, like all these random tight ends score points that aren't counted. So long story short, in this analysis, like it does boost wide receivers a little bit, but it also boosts running backs a little bit to the point where it's still even. And that's why I'm willing to call the flex like pretty confidently, like a 50% running back, 50% wide receiver question to that point. And I'm happy to get into the ADP question too, Leone, because I think that's slightly different. But that's the first answer to your line of questioning, that like removing undrafted players doesn't seem to like change this analysis in a major way.
Right. And what's interesting though is if you look at it now, this is 3 years of data because we're using the Underdog ADP, and that's what we have it from. But the running back percentage as a ratio to the wide receiver percentage has grew substantially in 2022 compared to 2020 and 2021. So we did actually see the wide receiver and flex at a higher rate in 2020 and 2021, but not 2022. And in my mind, I felt like there was a clear ADP shift in 2022 in terms of how people were drafted. Now, you hate to kind of have confirmation bias where it's like 1 year of data and you don't want to like overplay that. But do you think that the ADP shift we saw last year, where the market was clearly a bit wide receiver heavier, seems like that's carried over this year when you look at some of the big board ADPs? Do you think that is affecting these results, or do you think it just kind of random and the 3 year average is what it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't thought too much about 2022 specifically. But I think, look, I think the idea that ADP is getting sharper is probably directionally accurate. What I will say is like a couple things. Oftentimes when people are referencing ADPs historically being really bad, they're often talking about the quarterback position as the biggest example of that. Like, examples of Tom Brady, Peyton Manning going in the first round, examples of, Cam Newton in his prime being like the 7th quarterback off the draft boards behind like pocket passers, like, Matt Ryan, whatever. Like, I think the idea, that we've gotten better at drafting quarterbacks definitely seems to be true. I'm a little bit skeptical about the other positions, but what I will say is, and this kind of gets into the spike week stuff, so don't want to jump around too much, but if you look at the spike weeks, like there is some evidence, and maybe let's hold off on getting the details now, but I think there is some evidence in my analysis that we've gotten better at identifying RB1s in terms of spike weeks, and also gotten better at identifying wide receiver 2s and wide receiver 3s. There's some trends there in my research that show that at those positions, I think we're maybe getting a little bit sharper at identifying spike weeks. But yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical that like we can just say, hey, ADP is sharper than ever.
Yeah,
Like, last year was
not
totally different.
like necessarily sharper, but wide receivers were being taken earlier than they have been in the past last year, which I think that I feel pretty confident that that's accurate. And if you're looking at Underdog ADP and removing the undrafted players, although I guess maybe that wouldn't affect the undrafted players as much as it would, because you're still just looking at RB3. So maybe I'm like misapplying this to your chart here. I was just kind of thinking that, I guess that wouldn't necessarily affect like who's in the flex though.
Yeah, that's what I was like. I think once you start looking at like the preseason positional ADP of guys, we can talk about the ADP more. But yeah, in terms of just I think like at a high level, like fantasy football is based on real football, and like real football in the last 10 years, like kind of hasn't changed that much. And NFL teams like use the running back position, they use the wide receiver position, like regardless of who these players are, whether they come early or late in drafts, like running backs are going to score points, wide receivers are going to score points. And that's been like how those positions have scored points has been relatively stable over time. So just in terms of like, scoring in the flex, like I'm pretty skeptical that, running backs are going to start getting killed in the flex going forward, because there's been some big change in how the NFL works over the past 10 years. Like, I don't think we have a lot of reason to believe that.
Yeah, this was actually the most surprising thing to me about your thread. I know we've jumped around a little bit. We can jump back to the spike weeks, but since you brought it up, I've definitely probably pushed that narrative incorrectly, that it feels like running back usage is different. But what you've looking at running back weighted opportunities and, a metric that was based on Scott Barrett's research, as well as just like workhorse running backs based on like carries per game. We saw a drop off like 10 years ago, but then over the last 10 years, seems like a little bit stable. We've seen in terms of the very high end, at least. I know you have the chart here with running backs receiving 15 plus carries has dropped off a little bit. So it seems like less those really high end running backs and more maybe like that second tier of running backs. I know I felt like some of the issues that actually hurts zero RB, and I felt like this last year for me, Sam, was I found less of like the JD McKissick types. I felt like,
Yep.
where like these pure pass catching backs that you could like, okay, I'm going to plug this guy in and get, my 8 to 10 points. It's not going to be high upside, but I'm just going to get it. Um, those feel like they're disappearing to me. So I'd be interested to seeing, not just the research on
Yep.
like what's happening with the high end backs, but like the specialized backs as well.
I think that's super interesting. And yeah, like the point of this thread, and I don't think we'll have time to cover all of it now, but I'd encourage people to read it on Twitter, is like it's what you said. Like I think that running back has changed. Like the way NFL teams use running backs has changed a lot versus like the 2006 to 2010 range. But since like 2011 or 2012, it really hasn't changed a ton, especially once you look at weighted opportunities versus just carries. And weighted opportunities just factors in targets being twice as valuable as a carry in half PPR. That's some research Scott Parrott has done. But yeah, the way I'd sort of describe it is like, maybe the guys who are getting 15 plus carries per game are a little bit rarer versus like 2012, 2013. But I think that's kind of been boosted by the, I don't know, DeAndre Swift, Austin Eckler, Alvin Kamara types, guys that get lighter rushing workloads, but have bigger receiving workloads. I think those type of guys are on the rise. But yeah, the archetype you mentioned of like the pure passing down back, I haven't looked at this in the data, so this is more speculation, but I think that's also in decline, like you said. So people are like saying, oh, NFL is using committees more than ever. I'm pretty skeptical that the usage of committees has changed that much in the NFL in the past 10 years. And it could have actually changed in a way to hurt zero RB, like you said, where we can't just pick up James White for pennies in the last round. Those type of guys, especially in half PPR, are seemingly less valuable and rare than ever. So I'm skeptical of those sort of like arguments that the NFL is fundamentally changing how they've used the running back, versus 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I think the weighted opportunity adjustment makes sense, where it's like, okay, maybe we're not loading guys up with carries as much as before, but it's being offset by them utilizing the passing game a little bit more, and it comes out even. You looked at running backs receiving 20 plus weighted opportunities per game over the last 9 years, and it's like 15 per game, and it's really steady. It was at 16 in each of 2022 and 2021. I did take us by like the spike weeks a little bit just because I thought about that. But
Yep.
the kind of natural progression is like, okay, the running back is used in the flex, but what about like weekly upside? Are we getting more spike weeks from the wide receiver position than the running back position?
Yeah, I think that's the, if you're someone who's a wide receiver heavy drafter, that's probably the next line of argument you give that, hey, okay, median scoring, running backs and wide receivers, they're hitting the flex, 50% of the time. That's fine. I still want to draft wide receivers because they're way more likely to give me a spike week than running back. And again, like this sounds true. And like, I thought this was true forever, because you think of guys like MVS, who on the Packers would have, I don't know, 2 catches for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns. And it seems like those type of spike weeks at wide receiver can just pop up out of nowhere. And that seems like, that this should be the more volatile and spikier position. But when you actually look at the numbers, that's not quite true. I'll sort of parse through this slowly, but I looked at 3 different thresholds of spike weeks based on replacement level scores. I called these minor spikes, which is 10 plus points above replacement, major spikes, which is 17.5 points above replacement, and then mega spikes, which are 25 points above replacement. And you actually see that, especially at the higher spike thresholds, running backs and wide receivers are basically more or less the same in terms of delivering spike weeks, in terms of raw number of spike weeks. And actually, from like an individual bet level, if I'm going into a draft and this is a skewed way to look at things. I'll get to that later, but say you're going into the draft and you're in the third round or you're in the second round, whatever. It actually doesn't matter what round you're in. You're in any round. Your choice is a running back or wide receiver. That running back bet gives you a higher odds of a spike week simply because there are less running backs that are drafted and that are useful in fantasy, essentially. So if that logic makes sense, like there's the same amount of total spike weeks at running back and wide receiver, but there's actually fewer running backs that are in the drafted pool of players. So your odds of getting like a huge spike week with each individual pick is actually slightly higher at running back than wide receiver. This isn't a huge difference. Like if I'm like summarizing this, I'm more inclined to say that running back and wide receiver are relatively like equivalent in terms of giving you spike weeks. But it actually does show a slight advantage to the running back in delivering spike weeks, which again, I think goes against like commonly held beliefs in half PPR best ball.
Yeah. And then when we get into the ADP side of things, where, again, the pushback might be like, how predictable is it based on where you're drafting guys? You've got the top 12 RBs by ADP make up a higher share of running back spike weeks than, the wide receiver ones relative to spike weeks. So this kind of is in line with some research I had looked at too. I did an article this was a couple of years ago, talking about zero RB on Underdog. And if you look at the correlation to seasonal scoring, this was from some FFPC data, so it was full PPR, so it was a little bit different. But for full season scoring, like running back ADP and wide receiver ADP was actually pretty similar as far as the R squared between ADP and full season scoring. If you looked at weekly scoring, though, the running back stuff was actually a little bit more predictable than the wide receiver stuff. So I don't really think the ADP argument kind of holds steady. I think when you apply that to half PPR, when you talk about MVS, I think of it less as like a guy like MVS can have a huge spike week, which would be kind of like the pro argument. I think more of like a guy like MVS in half PPR has a better chance of matching Devontae Adams on a week.
Yeah.
Because when you take out, Adams goes 9 for 90, like that's a pretty big full PPR game. Half PPR, MVS finds the end zone and like they're equal. So you do actually get some, I believe, like leveling off there with the half PPR scoring.
Yeah. 100%. And yeah, just to talk through some of these numbers a little bit more, here we're looking at, so this is just to be clear, it's a little confusing. Previously, like we were defining RB1s as just like weekly RB1 by just like weekly ranked score. This is RB1 by preseason positional ADP. So this is like a different definition of RB1, just to be clear. And we see across all spike week thresholds that RB1s account for a higher share of their positions spike weeks than do wide receiver ones. And it's also true, it's close, but it's also true that running back ones account for just a higher raw total of spike weeks than do wide receiver ones across all these thresholds. So whether you're thinking of it as like running backs relative to their position or just like RB1s versus wide receiver ones, like RB1s are just historically better bets for delivering spike weeks than wide receiver ones. And yeah, I think the pushback to this, which is shown in the next chart, is like, hey, you're using data from 10 years ago. Like, what the hell is this ADP data from 2015? Like, it's some, casual leagues. Like, you can't trust this. If you replicate the same analysis with just Underdog's last 3 years of data, which I think, you can make arguments that maybe 2022 is sharper than 2021, but I think it's, if you're being fair, you have to say that Underdog data over the past 3 years is like relatively sharp ADP data. We see these trends are even more pronounced, like especially at the higher spike week thresholds, that like, if you want a spike week from running back, like, man, you better get an RB1. Like, you don't have to, like, obviously, you can get them from other positions, but if you're comparing it to wide receiver one, running back one just is a better bet over the past 3 years to deliver a spike week than a wide receiver one.
Yeah. And I think you had noted once you pass on RB1s, you're reducing your chance of finding a tournament winning spike week at running back by 50%. Where does that number come from?
Yeah, so this is like this comes from the major spike threshold. And that's basically 20. Let's see, that's 25 points per game essentially. So if you wanted to define tournament winning as like a 35 point week, then that number would even go up. So that 50% like is just, we see that in the major spikes chart. Running RB1s make up 50% of the major spike. So meaning like if you pass on them, you've just lost like 50% chance at a quote unquote major spike. But yeah, it depends how you define that threshold. I think like the bottom line is like, what I wanted to push back on is I like just so many times hear people just pass on RB1 and like not even, they seem to like almost consider going wide receiver heavy as like an upside play. And they like don't acknowledge that if you're passing on RB1s, like historically, that's just a very like it could be a safer play, but you're ignoring the upside like entirely
Yeah.
in that type of build.
I wish I had it up, but Ben Dominguez on Twitter, he's done some good data science visuals recently, but he had something with let me see if I can pull this up for
Yeah.
a second. Just because I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Oh no, go ahead.
So you could see he looked at robust wide receiver strategies and kind of found what you're saying, which is these strategies had like a little bit better like mean outcome than other strategies. But when
Mhm.
you do start to look at the upside and the right tail, um, they actually provided slightly worse outcomes than like all other strategies in terms of roster points scored over the course of a season. Now, so this isn't looking at weekly upside, so there might be some pushback there. But in terms of Underdog 2022 total roster points,
Mhm.
um, essentially robust wide receiver drafts were safer. They were better overall, but they did not provide more upside than if you grouped all other non-robust wide receiver strategies.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's really interesting. And like, I've heard like sort of proponents of zero RB make the case that it's almost more of a floor than a ceiling strategy, particularly in redraft, where well, that's a whole other ball game where you can pick up running backs off the waiver wire, all that whole
yeah,
different dynamics. But it's definitely true that running backs bust at a higher rate than wide receiver. So if you're just loading up an early wide receiver, I can see why that has a good advance rate. I think it's like a good floor play, but I'm quite skeptical that like, zero RB, like an extreme zero RB strategy, obviously like it could take down a tournament. Like you can land the nuts on the late round running backs. Like that's certainly not impossible, but I think you have to acknowledge like how much upside you're throwing away when you pass on the RB1s. And what I think is interesting about this chart too is we can see that another way to make this argument is the drop off from RB1s to then RB2s and RB3s is massive. Like, say you want to look at the major spike threshold, RB1s make up 49% of the spike weeks. RB2s only 10%. That's terrible. RB3s 17%. Whereas at wide receiver, that drop off from the wide receiver 1 to the wide receiver in 2 and 3s is a little bit smoother. Wide receiver 2s make up 25% of the spike weeks. Wide receiver 1s only make up 40%. Like that's a lot closer. So I think like, and we'll get into this later when we talk about maybe how to apply this to 2023, but I think you can have your cake and eat it too, in a sense where you can get running back 1 early. You can probably still get a wide receiver 1 early and then just load up on these wide receiver 2 and 3 bets, which, historically are better bets than running back 2 and running back 3. And that's sort of, the whole anchor or bimodal running back strategy that people talk about. Like, I
yeah. I
think in the
mean,
data, yeah, we see
you're
why that works.
you're avoiding the dead zone basically,
Yeah.
which is like okay, the RB1s maybe are too much getting like kind of lumped into that.
Yeah.
Is maybe what we're seeing in drafts. And Um, you might have noted this, and like I kind of ran with it in my head a little bit too, though. But when you're looking at specifically like Underdog Best Ball Mania with those 3 playoff weeks, I think you looked at like the odds of the spike weeks over like consecutive weeks.
Yep.
And it makes sense that like okay, you might get this random backup running back spiking like week 10 or something, or because the guy was out for a couple of weeks, and it's possible guy could be out for the season, and you get those spike weeks, continuously, but if you're looking at 3 in a row, your odds of doing that kind of stem from drafting these preseason workhorses. Obviously,
Yeah.
there's downside risk there, but if you get the right ones, there's almost nothing better in the tournament. And you see again, you go to the volatility of scoring. Like, I'd rather have, if you knew going into the playoffs you could have an RB1 that was healthy at that point in time, or wide receiver one that was healthy at that point in time, you'd probably take the RB1 because you're going to get more spike weeks relative to the position. It's a little bit more steady week to week. You think of like a CMC going into the playoffs, you'd rather have than Devontae Adams, who we noted was fully healthy and had like those 2 awful weeks in 15, 16, just because that just happens a little bit more often at the wide receiver position.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. And I looked into this a little bit. If you jump way down in the charts, I think it's like chart slide 33 on what I sent you. It's way down. But I looked in this question a little bit of like, okay, maybe it's true that RB1s look like better bets when you just look at sort of the entire position. I think it's this one here. But isn't it true that just like those running back spike weeks, it's just like one or two or just like a handful of running backs that are making up all the spike weeks, and that masks the fact that there's huge bust rates for these RB1s? I found that basically, at least over the last 3 years, it is not true. The metric that I'm using to make that claim is average spikes per player for RB1s and wide receiver ones. So this is the number of major spikes that a running back had, given they had at least one spike, if that makes sense. So these are sort of like you hit on a spiky running back one. It gave you at least one major spike week. How many did it give you on average? It gave you, over the last 3 years, about 2 major spikes. And that's true for the wide receiver ones as well. If you hit on a spiky wide receiver one, it gave you 2 spiky weeks. So I was a little skeptical of the argument that maybe if you look at from a median perspective, there's, much higher bust rates are running back, and there's this huge dynamic where, the wide receiver ones are much safer. But from the spike week perspective, like, we're not really seeing that come out in the data as much, where it's not true that like these running back one spike weeks are just like a couple of guys making up all the spike weeks and everybody else busts. Like you can't really say that with the data.
And I feel like even if it was like more in the middle, like let's say it was moving towards that side, something I've written about the hyperfragile running back strategy, like I'd be okay with that, right?
Yeah,
like
I'd be okay with that too. Yeah.
You sort of like accept your losses when you get the bus, just because you know what the upside is when you hit on the correct RB1s. There's like almost nothing more powerful than hitting on the correct RB1s. But let's sort of kind of take a step back now. So what's interesting is all this stuff is, despite the fact that people may be misunderstanding exactly why wide receiver heavy strategies may or may not work on Underdog, we do see them, work overall. And in particular, the research I've seen, in previous years, I've looked at like advance rates by running back roster construction, was kind of like an elementary way, but just basically looking at the number of running backs you draft early and the total number of running backs you draft. Essentially, you can take running backs early. You could take a lot of running backs, but you can't do both, right? Like it doesn't really work that way. And then this year, for that article series I mentioned, I kind of came up with a draft capital metric, which basically just for each draft slot determined how much capital it was worth. And you kind of see the people that spend less draft capital at running back overall, they tended to have better advance rates. So I guess the question is, given everything we've just covered, why is it still the case that you can't overinvest in the running back position?
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting one. And to be clear, like, again, I want to say that my research doesn't like prove that heavy wide receiver is bad, or even necessarily that zero RB is bad. Like that's a more complicated question. I think
it's not even what you're trying to do. You're kind of looking at like, we need to understand why something works or doesn't work, or we should try to understand it.
That was my whole point, is like, if the strategy works, we better understand why it works. And I guess I was a little bit frustrated with like how people seem to be missing the facts of what's actually going on. So that was sort of the point of my research.
You got to mute the thread on Twitter, Sam. That's the only move. Just mute thread and let people misunderstand. No, I've been there. I know it can be frustrating.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because like people will be angry on both sides. Like the zero RB people think I'm coming after them and saying their strategy is terrible, or I'm coming after the heavy wide receiver build and saying it's terrible. That's not true. But back to your question, like why is it true that wide receiver heavy builds are still successful? I think so. This is me getting maybe more into more speculation than facts. If I was to summarize it, I think it's that we've kind of like galaxy brained the hell out of running back versus wide receiver, and all the differences and how one is spikier than the other, blah blah blah. If you just sort of took the labels off running back and wide receiver in my analysis and called them something else, you would kind of say like, huh, these two positions like perform pretty similarly. Like they're pretty similar, giving you spike weeks. Like their ADP is like directionally similar. Like you'd probably see the dead zone effect a little bit, right? Like there's certainly some differences, but like I think it's a fair takeaway to say like, huh, running back and wide receiver, take the labels off of it. In the data, they don't look that different. What is different is you need 3.5 wide receivers in underdog fantasy with that flex spot. I'm calling that half wide receiver, and you need 2.5 running back spots in underdog fantasy. So like that ratio of 3.5 to 2.5, I think explains a ton of why your research, like you want to limit your capital at the running back position. Like if you need a full additional wide receiver versus a running back, then obviously like you need to take more of them. Like you got to fill those spots every week. I think like that's I'm oversimplifying here, obviously, but I would say that explains like a lot more of the difference in why wide receiver heavy builds work than some of this other stuff that we like to get into. But again, that's me trying to summarize a bunch of things into a simple point. But I think that's sort of my hypothesis right now.
Yeah, and if you did like, I don't know, just a quick calculation, it's just one more spot. But when you think of the best ball scoring, like that scales in terms of the number of bench players. So like if you wanted like 2.5x the amount of roster spots devoted based on the number of starters. So like for running backs, 2.5 running backs times 2.5, just to give a metric, like that's 6 running backs, whereas 3.5 wide receivers times like a 2.5x, you're at like 9 wide receivers. So right there, you're at 6 running backs versus 9 wide receivers. So
Yeah.
so basically, if you held true everything you said, you're still looking at, you kind of want to maintain that ratio over your total draft capital spent. However, you want to dice it up between early, late, total number of spots taken. The ratio should hold, which is, 3.5 to 2.5. You want to be spending, 40% more on the wide receiver position. Rough. And again, we're
Yeah.
speculating a little bit here. I kind of want to look into that 40% number, but that's like roughly, the idea is that.
Yep.
And the other thing I want to touch on here too, though, that I felt like last year, Sam, is when I got into these really wide receiver heavy rooms early. So kind of just thinking more through the meta of an actual draft, was because you kind of max out that capital at running back at a certain point. I did sometimes find it hard to like zag where like I got a couple good running backs values early, but it's like now the running back values are persisting throughout the draft and I can't really take them because I'm kind of maxed out and I'm behind at wide receiver now. And it's hard for me to get caught up at wide receiver. So it's just a weird dynamic where it feels like, and I guess that probably comes back to the 40% thing where, you're just starting to lose the available capital you can add to wide receivers. So even if it's a wide receiver heavy room, you do have to be somewhat careful with how you're allocating running back spots, even knowing it's undervalued.
Yeah, that's tricky. And like I think what I try to think of like in fantasy is the concept of like diminishing returns. So to give an illustrative example, like say you just started off your draft with 5 straight wide receivers and you have the choice of George Pickens versus Aaron Jones in the 6th. I think their ADPs are relatively close. If Aaron Jones hits for you there, he's going to provide massive leverage to your team. You have 0 running backs. Like presumably all the running backs you get later in the draft are very risky bets if they haven't been drafted by now. So he's going to provide huge leverage to your team, like whatever, call it 250 points to your team if he hits. George Pickens, on the other hand, you just started off your draft with, Jamar Chase, Chris Olave, Drake London, whoever. If George Pickens hits, if George Pickens hits, there's sort of two possibilities. Either one, he hits but doesn't provide that much value to your team because the rest of the wide receivers you took early hit. So like a bunch of times his points won't score in your lineup, or he's going to add a lot of value to your team. But that means that some of the wide receivers you took earlier busted, right? So like from a diminishing returns perspective, there's not that much value in tacking on George Pickens to the team where you started with 5 wide receivers versus Aaron Jones. Even if you think like George Pickens is a better individual bet than Aaron Jones, you have to factor in like that concept of diminishing returns. And so it's the same thing with what you said. Like if I start off, CMC, Kenneth Walker in my drafts this year in 2023, I might think that Aaron Jones is a smash of a value instead of like Treylon Burks, if that's the choice I have. Maybe I run the projections and I think that's the case. Like still, I'm going to go with Treylon Burks because again, that same concept, like you just got to factor in what roster construction you already have. So I agree with you. It's not like super straightforward on how you can take advantage of this. Like you have to kind of capitulate to the draft room to some extent. I do have like one very strong take on how I think you can find an edge right now in drafts, but I largely agree with you that like it's not as simple as just saying, oh, running backs like look like they're undervalued and they're better picks. Let me take 6 of them through 10 rounds. Like no, like I strongly don't think that is the optimal strategy.
Yeah, and to your point about like the diminishing returns, not to like be redundant here, but like again, the difference between like you're in a redraft, let's say like the FFPC Football Guys Championship, where it's full PPR and it's managed, right? You might take Pickens as that 6 wide receiver because what you're most concerned about is like odds of a breakout, and like you want 4 top 15 wide receivers, and like that's super important. When you take it to 1 half PPR best ball, like obviously you're losing some upside points with it going to half PPR, but also like it's not just the diminishing returns on Pickens versus the receivers you've already drafted. You also have random ass wide receivers that can crack your lineup, right?
Yeah.
That like that have zero value in the redraft, right? But now in best ball, so like you're also kind of then taking away that possibility of like receivers you could take in rounds 15, 16, just having random spike weeks. So like it's best ball is a different game. Like, the dynamics of the scoring make it very different.
Yeah. To build on that, like another, and we didn't quite get into this with the spike week charts, but we talked about how RB1s are better bets for spike weeks relative to wide receiver ones. The converse of that is that the later round wide receivers are actually better bets for spike weeks than later round running backs. And, we can talk about how later round wide receivers maybe changed in the past couple of years where wide receivers are getting pushed up boards. It's not as easy to find these wide receivers late in drafts that deliver spike weeks. Like, sure, I think maybe some of that is true, but you can draft wide receivers that pretty safely project to be in 2 wide receiver sets, like very late in drafts. Like even right now, like no one wants to draft him, but Adam Thielen, they just paid him 14 million guaranteed, like gross pick. He's going to be on the field. Like Darius Slayton, only big body wide receiver basically in New York. They guaranteed the most money. You can get him at pick 200. Like, okay, I may be like, expressing too much confidence in some of these later round wide receivers. Obviously, like either of those guys could be massive busts, but like those guys exist. And like you said, yeah, if you hammer 7 straight wide receivers, I think you basically have to like stop taking wide receivers entirely. And I think some of those later round wide receivers are better bets relative to running back. And you're kind of sacrificing that element of it when you kind of go overboard wide receiver heavy early in drafts.
Yeah. And I kind of have completely overused the phrase usable players the last couple of years when it comes to best ball, but you're sort of saying usable players. And I did some research for, again, the draft series that I'm working on for Best Ball Mania. And if you look at, there's a lot more to it than just drafting usable players, because a lot of it's randomness with injuries and stuff. But at the end of the season, if you have just non-zero players in your lineup, like your odds of winning a playoff stage increase dramatically, like with each extra non-zero player you have. So that was kind of my way of filtering out like guys who were hurt or just weren't playing, was like if they even scored any fantasy points at all for the week, they counted as a non-zero player. And you start to see absurd increases in your expected value as you go, add those not usable players. Now, some of that's because like the more non-zero players you have, that's like the higher likelihood that your early picks did not get injured. And like that's important. It's not just saying that like drafting guys late that are going to contribute in any way is like super, super important. But I do think there's at least like a little bit something to that where these wide receivers drafted at the end of the drafts, like they're going to be on the field and they can get you points. Whereas some of these handcuffed backs we take, um, they might be like drawing really dead to contribute in any
Yeah.
fashion whatsoever. You don't want to completely ignore these guys because you can hit some big upside on them. But
Yeah.
it's a game you got to mix and match, right? Like you got to understand your total risk and reward.
And again, like if we're, again, back to the point, fantasy football is based on real football. Um, on any play in football, there's usually one running back on the field and there's three wide receivers on the field. And that's just going to lend itself to the idea that running backs are more scarce than wide receivers. I think we're like very familiar with this concept when we play super flex quarterback with quarterback. Like the quarterbacks are gone quickly. And then like, good luck. You're going to draft like Kyle Trask and hope he gets starts this year. You're going to draft like Sam Darnold and hope Lance and Purdy both fail. Like, good luck. And I think like we kind of underrate how at running back, like that's basically true too. It's not quite true. Like a lot of teams use two running backs now, but like not a lot of backfields support two usable running backs. And again, this is me ignoring injury rate, like handcuff, that type of stuff happens. But like, I think we kind of ignore the scarcity at running back like a little bit too much now. Like it is the more scarce position than wide receiver, just based on like how real football is played. So yeah, you got to weigh that with the idea that you need more wide receivers in your lineup in fantasy football too. So it's like the push and pull there, figuring out where to sort of draw the line is tricky. But yeah, just wanted to make that point on sort of the scarcity of running back. I think gets a little overlooked.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation. Excited to do more best ball content over the course of the off season. Again, make sure you're following Sam at Sherman_FFB on Twitter for more great content and threads like the ones that drove the conversation today. Also, check him out on ADP Chasing with Davis Maddock on Friday afternoons. That's on the Ship Chasing YouTube channel, correct?
That's correct. Yep. Every Friday throughout the offseason, we'll be there talking ADPs, talking market movements. So yeah, can come find me there.
Awesome. And you can be on the lookout for the article I keep teasing. It's going to be kind of 4 different parts, but part 1 should be up today or tomorrow over on Established to Run, kind of my best ball mania draft manifesto, trying to combine the expected value increase you get from advancing in the regular season with the expected value increase you get from building teams optimally for specifically the playoff stages, and helping you sort of figure out what to prioritize when you're drafting. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Best of luck this draft season.